Top Med Talk. Welcome to Top Med Talk. I'm Andy Cumpstey and I'm here at the Evidence Based Perioperative Medicine World Congress, that's EBPOM 2025. And it's been a really fantastic 3 days, but I'm absolutely delighted to be sitting here with a well-known name and a well-known voice at Top Med Talk. She's agreed to come back and do a special periop profile with us. So welcome back to the show, Professor Ramani Moonesinghe.
Hi Andy, lovely to see you and it's brilliant to be here, thank you.
You know, I'm sitting here looking at a list of some of the many things you've done in your career, from consultant clinician to super experienced and high achieving researcher, to advising NHS England on perioperative care, to advising NHS England on critical care through the COVID pandemic, being awarded an Officer of the Order of the British Empire in 2021 for your services to anaesthesia critical care. We could go on and on and on, but I mean, how do you find the time?
I think you probably ought to ask my family that. Well, one of the things that I've learned as I've gone on a bit is to try and align things that I do as much as possible. When I started my consultant career, certainly I did loads of different things that were quite disparate. And over time, I've sort of tried to align them a bit more. Say, for example, the research that I do on the whole tends to feed into the work that I do on policy and so on. So trying to sort of, getting two for the price of one kind of thing. But, some early mornings, some late nights, not that many because I've got a family. So, and a great team, best of which obviously are my family, but a great professional team as well.
We should start right at the beginning. So where did Ramani grow up? Where did Ramani go to school? How did this amazing career take off?
So I am a second generation immigrant. So my parents were from Sri Lanka. They moved to the UK in 1961 with £375, which was more than it is now, but it's still not that much. My mother had left school when she was 12. My dad had school when he was 18, but messed around too much to go to university, much to his parents' upset. So they kind of came here with no qualifications, with my sister, who is 17 years older than me, as a 5-year-old who came over on the boat with them, and then had to sort of start a new life here. So they both had like 2 or 3 jobs. My dad learned how to be an accountant by correspondence course. My mum worked as a typist in the government office in one of the departments, and they went on from there. And then by the time I came along in the early 1970s, they were financially much more secure. I had a very different upbringing to my sister, but she grew up in quite poverty in a fairly hard environment socioeconomically, whereas I grew up in comfort and went to a private school and all those sorts of things. So it's very different. Anyway, I grew up in South London. I went to a private school. I was moderately academic at school. I did a lot of swimming, so I swam at county level, and I did a lot of music, played the piano. I did quite well at GCSE, and then I stopped working. I wasn't at all sure I wanted to be a doctor, actually. Coming from the sort of heritage that I came from and my parents' background and all the rest of it, I think, without wishing to stereotype too much, I think if there are any friends and colleagues listening that also come from a immigrant Asian background, they might recognise the sort of, you'll go to university and do a vocational degree. I kind of felt that medicine was hardwired into my future, and so I scraped in to UCL, where I went as an undergraduate, and enjoyed university, but spent most of my time doing stuff that didn't involve learning anatomy and physiology, medical school shows, student union stuff, all of that. And then came out the other side, and it really wasn't until I was about a month into being a house officer, or what we would now call an FY1, and I'd got over my initial absolute abject terror of the whole thing, that I started to really enjoy it and realised that actually medicine was the career I wanted. So I was lucky, because I think it really wasn't until that time that I was at all convinced that I would stick with it. I really started to love it when I started doing it, and went on from there.
I love that choice of phrase of medicine was sort of hardwired into me. So, where does that hardwiring come from if you weren't convinced it was the right thing to do?
So my sister, who is 17 years older than me, had also become a doctor. So she was the first doctor in our family. So my sister went to Middlesex and came out. And so I'd sort of always looked up to her. Medicine's obviously a career that still today, even though it's much harder for junior resident doctors these days, but it's still kind of thought of as an sort of societally important career, I guess. My family really wanted that for me. They wanted the security of a job that they felt would be a job for life. And I'm just lucky, really lucky, that it turned out to be the right choice for you, because I'm not, as I say, it could easily not have been.
At what point did anaesthesia, perioperative medicine and critical care medicine sort of appear on your horizons?
Yeah, so it took a while. I didn't really know anything about anaesthesia coming out of university. I thought if I was going to stick with medicine when I left university, I thought I was either going to be an oncologist or a cardiologist. And my second house job involved 3 months of oncology, and I spent most of it crying into my beer in the evenings. I found it really depressing and really, really hard. And so that was that. So it definitely wasn't going to be oncology. And then my first SHO job was doing cardiology at St Thomas's, and it was absolutely awful. All I did was clot people for angiograms and put femstops on. So I was done with cardiology after that. But I finished a medical rotation and got my MRCP and all those things. Towards the end of it, I did intensive care medicine for the first time at St Thomas's Hospital, and I absolutely fell in love with it. After I did that first 6 months, I did another 6 months, and I went off and did a few other things, then came back to it. And it was a chance conversation with one of the consultants at St Thomas's. His name's Duncan Winkle. I think I was doing an ALS course, and we were just chatting, and he was asking me about what my next steps were. And I was like, I don't know. I want to do intensive care medicine, but I don't quite know how to get there. He said, why don't you go off and do some anaesthesia? Because you'll learn some transferable skills and, all of that stuff. So I went, all right then. So I applied for an anaesthesia rotation, got the rotation in North London, and started doing it. And again, just fell in love with the subject. So I didn't just do the year or whatever that I might have done. I did the full rotation and then thought, right, I'll do both. So I went off and did training in both. And so I got a CCT in both anaesthesia and intensive care.
What was it that really convinced you that was the right thing to do after all that period of uncertainty?
You get to know the patient so well, both from a physiological perspective, but also from the whole holistic perspective in both anaesthesia and critical care. You have to know the patients that well. I loved the immediacy of it. I loved the physiology of it. I found it exciting and interesting. I felt like it was something where you really felt you were making an impact. Ironically, I didn't really enjoy doing outpatient clinics. And of course, now as a consultant, pretty much the only clinical practice I still do is an outpatient clinic as a preoperative assessment clinic. But at the time, I was kind of really interested in doing stuff that was all about inpatient care and so on.
And is there anything, looking back on that journey now, that you regret about that choice? Is there any other specialty you think you should have gone for, or anything you wish you'd explored further?
No, because from a clinical perspective, I really still absolutely love both specialties. I suppose the only thing I would think about as I ended up in an academic career as well, and even actually from a policy perspective, they are a bit poor relations still. So I think if you're a cancer doctor or a cardiologist, people listen more when you want to pitch grant ideas or policy ideas or whatever. And still it can be quite hard, I think, and I feel like the radiologists probably identify with this as well, because we're supportive specialties. It can be sometimes harder to make the case for the importance of them. But the whole point of a supportive specialty is that everything else falls apart without it. So in myself, I feel comfortable and content with my choices. Somehow I wish I could convey the value of what we do more effectively to some audiences.
I want to come back to the policy and academic work in a second, but I want to pick up on the family aspect first, because I know that's so important to you. So why don't you tell us a bit more about your family?
Sure. So married when I was about 38. I've actually known my husband since I was in my early 20s, because his best friend from school was one of my best friends at university. So, we met each other back then, but we didn't get together until our late 30s. And so we got together, and when you get together at that age, you don't mess around. And we thought, right, let's have a family. But I kept having miscarriages. And so that was pretty tough for a few years. And then we decided, well, we do want to have a family and we could try IVF and all of those sorts of things. But we thought, actually, no, let's not do that. Let's adopt. So we went through the rather challenging process of being approved as adopters in the English social care system. That took a year to get approved. Took about another 6 months to identify some children that we could adopt. Another year to be finally their adoptive parents. So this is now 2017. Our sons, James and Zach, came to live with us in July of 2017. And I was just in the middle of a research fellowship at that time. They were 11 months and 22 months when they came to live with us. And yeah, talk about how to turn your life upside down. 2 children at the same time. So I really feel for people who have twins or triplets. And of course, having adopted children is, I'm not thinking it's more of a challenge than having children biologically, but there are certainly some very big challenges around the disruption to them, the feeling of loss that they have moving from their foster parents, who are very fantastic people who we're still in touch with, into our home. So there's a lot of challenge that you have to overcome with trying to basically bring these people into your family. But that's what we did. Time went on and they settled in with us and everything else. And then December 2019, we got a phone call between Christmas and New Year, and it was social services saying, oh, they've got a biological sister, full biological sister. Would you like her? We're like, okay, well, I'm doing much in 2020. Go on then. And so it was. And so we agreed that we would adopt their full biological sister. And then, of course, March 2020 came and everything changed. The whole world changed. But luckily for us, we went through with everything. And our daughter Astrid came to live with us at the age of 15 months in July of 2020. So that was a nice end to the first wave for us.
I do want to pick up on what you just said about the challenges of going through the adoption process. Now, I've known you a long time, and I can't imagine you saying many things are challenging. So I've got to ask you more about that.
Depends what sort of person you are. So I think I'm kind of a heart on sleeve type of person. I'm quite open. My husband, on the other hand, is less so. He's quite introverted. You wouldn't mind me saying that. The process of being approved as an adopter is very intrusive. It's something that you have to be prepared for. The social workers go over your entire history with a fine-tooth comb. Multiple interviews with you, multiple interviews with your family, multiple interviews with your friends. I mean, it's quite a thing. So that level of scrutiny puts a pressure on you. It's a pressure, frankly, on your relationship with your partner. And it just goes on and on and on for like a year. And then you've still got that slight thing hanging over you. Well, actually, will we get approved? So it's stressful. And of course, all the while, you are still working, doing all the stuff that you're normally doing. Yeah, it is quite an additional sort of burden on top of normal life. And then even with the adoption process itself, once you have been approved, we had some really challenging moments. You've been living with us for 6 months and court cases come up and still there are sort of wrinkles in the process and all the rest of it. It's really stressful. So all's well that ends well. And now we've got all the usual challenges of having a young family, which I don't need to tell anybody about, but it's worked out well for us.
Another amazing achievement. But alongside doing all of that, you were keeping a full-time research career going. I mean, how did the research start? You talked about your clinical journey, but what point did you branch outwards to other things?
I did a BSc when I was an undergraduate, intercalated BSc like lots of people. I did 6 weeks in a lab, in a cardiology lab, looking at electron micrographs of rat endothelial tissue, having given them high and low dose ACE inhibitors to see if we could prevent restenosis after angioplasties. And it was beyond awful. That really put me off lab science. Although I'm very grateful to 2 people who got me into that. First was Hugh Montgomery, who then recommended me to Jean McEwen, who was my project supervisor, who retired not that long ago. So the people were lovely, but I didn't enjoy the science very much. And so I didn't really think about doing research again for a long time. And then I think I'd just passed my final FRCA and going through my clinical training. But Roberta Mythen saw me at a social event, I think, and said, yeah, we've got you down to do our fellowship in a couple of years' time. And I was like, have you? Oh, okay. So obligingly, I was like, oh, great. So that was how I got into doing a research fellowship. It's pretty different now, much more competitive. I got the feeling they were just a bit desperate to have a bum on a seat. But I then, when I did that fellowship, it was my last year of training and I did it part-time. My supervisor was Mike Greycroft, who's now like Monty, my great friend. He had an idea that he wanted to do something to do with risk in major surgery, and he wanted me to do a systematic review of all the risk prediction models that there were in major surgery, and I still haven't forgiven him for that, because I reviewed 200,000 abstracts for that systematic review. It was a pretty grim winter when I did it. But anyway, in my first year as a consultant, I worked part-time clinically, 6 doing ICU and anaesthesia, and the other half of my job was finishing my research, which was a systematic review and then some studies of data that we had at UCLH looking at risk and outcome in patients having major surgery. And that's where I got into statistical modelling and that sort of thing. So that's how I got started. And then when I got into it, I really got into it and I really loved it. And although it took me a little while to actually write my thesis up and submit it, I did get there eventually. And part of the stimulus for me actually finally finishing it was because I wanted to apply for a fellowship that would give me a bit more time rather than trying to do it all in my spare time. And so I was lucky I got a fellowship from the Health Foundation, which started in 2015, and they paid my salary full time. And that's how we got PQIP off the ground.
People listening at home who may or may not fully understand that, but can you maybe just delve into the fellowship concept, why it's such a big thing, why it makes such a big difference in that sort of space that you're describing?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I got my consultant job, it was obviously a full-time clinical job. I was lucky to get APA, which is 4 hours a week of funding from our biomedical research centre. But basically, I was working 48 hours a week, of which 4 hours was programmed for research. So it's not enough really to be able to really get your teeth in stuff. And there was lots of stuff I wanted to do. So the fellowship for someone at that stage is a really great opportunity. It gives you, depending on the fellowship, either half of your time or more to devote to the research. And so there are various charities and other organisations that offer these sorts of fellowships. And at the time, I was pointed towards this one from the Health Foundation, which is a third sector organisation and a think tank and all of that. But they were interested in supporting people to learn about improvement science, or what might be called improvement studies now. And that was really right up my street. So I do lots of different types of research now, but I think at heart I'm an applied health researcher. And so this felt very practical, very applied, very relevant opportunity. And so the project that I put in was essentially to set up a national perioperative quality improvement programme. And they bought into it, and there it was.
And it's still going?
It's still going now.
You've achieved a huge amount over that research career already, but what are your sort of standout highlights that you're most proud of? Any sort of papers or achievements do you think that's what I want to be remembered for? That's what I'm really pleased we did?
So I suppose a project with impact was the development of the sort risk prediction model, which I was the senior author on. The hard work was done by my friend and colleague Joe Simpson, who's a consultant in Colchester, and by Karen Protopapa, who's a researcher with NCBOD. But that is great. It's being used internationally. It's simple. And so, hopefully that's an impact on clinical practice, which is all we can really hope for when we do research, I think. The thing that I'm most proud of is actually the team. We've got a really fantastic and growing team at UCL, where I'm based, but also much more broadly, which includes really strong collaborations with the College of Anaesthetists, really good collaboration with Southampton and so many other friends and colleagues across the country and internationally. So with Paul and Monash and Melbourne and so on and so forth, Kate Leslie and lots of others. But, lots of PhD students finished now. I think I've supervised 7 through to completion, and there's at least 3 more hoping to submit this year. We've built our team so that it's now very multidisciplinary in both senses of the word. So it's not just about doctors. We've got nurses and allied health professionals and pharmacists in our team, speech and language therapists and so on, dietitians. We've got a very multidisciplinary from a scientific perspective team as well. Qualitative researchers, social scientists, statisticians, data scientists. And then, of course, the sort of early translational work, the stuff that John Wickel does. I work with my husband, who's an inventor on device design. So I kind of feel that if you are interested in research in perioperative care or critical care more broadly, or even safety, that you could come to us and find a willing collaborator or some expertise. It was really strong.
Amazing. And that still isn't enough. And you've successfully moved into policy as well. How did that come around?
Well, again, really important to have people supporting you and that will listen to you. So there's 2 or 3 different senior colleagues that have really helped me. So when I was towards the end of my training, who was at one point the president of the Royal College of Anaesthetists, and Ernie Grundy, who was a training programme director in my region, sort of shuffled up to me in the coffee room at whichever hospital and said, they're looking for a trainee to stand for council membership of the Royal College of Anaesthetists. Why don't you go for it? I was a bit like, not sure about that. And I think they were obviously just desperately worried that nobody would stand. So I stood and I got elected on about 200 votes or something really pathetic. But I got in, and so that was 2008, and it took me through. I got my CCT in 2009, so I was on council for 4 years. It was an enormous privilege, huge privilege, and lots of friends that I made that were very senior consultants are still my friends today, and they really took me under my wing. It was a very, very friendly environment, but golly, did I learn a lot very, very quickly. I didn't open my mouth in a council meeting for 6 months, which might surprise anyone that knows me, but I just thought that old adage of better to be quiet and people think you're a fool than open your mouth and then realise you are. So, I just kept quiet. Anyway, I learned a lot there. And then that finished and I focused on my research for a bit. And then in 2015-ish, I was talking to someone called Celia Ingham Clark. Actually, she's just become a Dame Celia, who at the time was medical director at the Whittington Hospital and then had just moved into a role as NHS England as the medical director for clinical effectiveness. And I was telling her about PCOP, which was just getting off the ground, and the importance of perioperative care and all of that. And she was a colorectal surgeon by background, so she got it. But I think it was presented in a way that perhaps hadn't been presented before, and the value of it. But she did know the value of anaesthesia because she'd worked with Monty on introduction of enhanced recovery pathways and so on in the early 2000s. She went away and managed to advocate for NHS England to create a very small clinical advisory role for someone in what they called elective care back then. She encouraged me to apply for it, and I did. So in 2016, I became a national specialty advisor, I think they called it back then, for elective care. And then basically, I did that role and I was reappointed into it in 2019, but I didn't really feel I was very effective. It didn't feel like I knew, or the organisation knew quite how to take that role, quite how to use it. I found it quite tough. And then that all changed with COVID, because then suddenly perioperative care, and then, I took on a role for critical care. It was all completely thrust into the spotlight, and then that changed the way that I interacted with NHS England very substantially.
So, God, now we've come back to March 2020. You're at home with a new addition to a young family, enough challenges with research work, enough challenges as a clinician. You're advising the government in a national role on perioperative and critical care, and suddenly you're slap bang in the middle of the biggest challenge that ever faced our health service.
Yeah, it was interesting. So I didn't have the critical care role at the beginning of COVID. There wasn't one. And so I basically just sort of stuck my hand up and said, I'm an intensivist as well as an anaesthetist. If you think that would be useful, then very happy to help. And suddenly the phone started ringing. The work that I did start with was very mundane. It was going through spreadsheets of ventilators and other intensive care equipment that was on the NHS supply chain list and working out which ones would be suitable for mass procurement and so on. And then it rapidly evolved and became very diverse indeed. So everything from providing clinical leadership to the government's ventilator challenge through to writing guidelines or commissioning guidelines around how we look after patients, through to developing staffing guidelines, which was obviously controversial and difficult for everyone, communications with teams and regions and systems about how to do stuff. But overall, the two unifying themes of what I did and what I did with many, many other people, one of whom in particular I want to shout out to is James O'Carroll, who is now a consultant colleague in UCLH, but who I met for the first time in March 2020 and was a senior trainee at the time and was amazingly brilliant at all the stuff that he did. Anyway, lots of people contributed, but the two things that we did overarching were, first of all, to try and put stuff in the hands of clinicians so that the only thing that they had to think about was looking after the patient and not about where stuff was coming from. And I don't think that we got it perfectly right, but we did our best. And then the second thing that we did was to try and provide information in such a way that if you were working at Hospital A or Hospital B, you didn't start trying to just write your own guidelines and start from scratch and say, try to put out resources that everybody could use. And again, we may not have got that perfectly right. We may not have got it out quick enough, but we tried to play that coordinator role.
I mean, clearly an incredibly tough and challenging role and time for anyone. Obviously now it's different because we're looking backwards, but with that benefit of hindsight, I mean, what would you have done differently if you did have that time again, knowing what we know now?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I gave evidence to the COVID inquiry 2 or 3 months ago on the procurement module, which was all about, the equipment. Did we have it? Did we have enough? All that stuff. I don't know that I would necessarily do anything differently now with the benefit of hindsight. I think that what I wish is that we could have been better prepared. We were absolutely woefully underprepared. I think that We are better prepared now, but not substantially. And that is a residual worry to me. I think aside from that, there are some things that aren't necessarily my responsibility, but I think that we know now and that should guide our response to future emergencies of this type. There was a lot of discussion at the beginning of the pandemic about triaging patients, what things we would do differently in terms of looking after people. And I know that there was a huge amount of moral injury incurred by our colleagues, particularly our nursing staff, but by everyone, around having to dilute the standards of care that we normally apply in an intensive care setting, or indeed in any care setting, to look after the many, many multiples of patients that needed care. But the thing is that the moral injury of turning a single patient down would have surely been worse. So I think what I know now is that we just have to do our best. And the thing that the service needs to do is to support its staff from a practical perspective. So reassuring them that their best is good enough. And secondly, from a kindness and sort of supportive perspective, psychological support, physical support, and all of that. And if it happens again in our working lives, I hope we will have enough institutional memory to make sure that we provide that support more quickly, more effectively than perhaps we did last time.
Let's move on from COVID.
Yes, please.
So I think in another way, you used to call yourself a peri-optimist.
Yes.
Looking forwards, COVID behind us, now looking ahead to hopefully a pandemic-free period in front of us, what should we be looking forward to? What are the exciting things on the horizon?
I think from a sort of discovery science perspective, there's so many things on the horizon. Obviously, the opportunities in data, machine learning and all of that. I mean, look, I am both an enthusiast and also ever so slightly cynical about it because, I've developed a risk prediction model, which is so simple. It's, you can do it on your phone. And yet the penetration of that into clinical practice is far from complete, but it works well. So let's do the simple things well. And then, of course, we can have the fancy machine learning algorithms as well, but let's do the simple stuff well. Anyway, I think that when we get over the challenges of trying to link data better, when we start to look at interesting different data sources, I would be lovely to have access to people's shopping data, all this sort of stuff, and try and learn about what we can learn about people and what we can learn about risk and so on from all of that. So the data opportunities there. And then obviously from a more translational physiological science, I suppose, perspective, friends and colleagues doing work to try and understand the biology of post-operative outcomes, really important stuff. And, hopefully we will succeed in identifying some interventions, improving the way that, we had a great talk yesterday about hemodynamic monitoring and optimization. We keep coming back to the trials that are neutral in their outcomes and so on. And it's probably that we don't have the tools that we need to monitor physiology as well as we should. And then if we get that right, then we'll be able to develop the interventions that then modify it. So I think there's a lot to be done there. My big passion is health inequalities now. And so I'm kind of itchy and irritable about the progress that there's been sort of societally on particularly deprivation and poverty. And so we're starting a big program of work looking at interventions to try and improve outcomes for people from deprived backgrounds. I've talked about it on Top Med Talk before. So that's exciting work and fun, and hopefully will generate some insights that are generalizable beyond perioperative care. The 10-year plan for the NHS was published last week. It's a very aspirational document. For something that's over 150 pages long, there's not very much detail in it. But what I think the big ticket items are in there from a perioperative perspective are including the move to neighbourhood health, which I think is really interesting. So trying to move as much care out of secondary care into primary care and community care as possible. And that's going to have big implications for us as perioperative clinicians. That's going to mean anaesthetists going and doing preoperative assessment clinics in the community. It's going to be discharging patients on the day of surgery or the morning after and giving them a wearable to go home with and monitoring them from home and monitoring them from the hospital when they've gone home. So I think those are really exciting opportunities there. And then the final thing is the whole kind of robots and sort of the technical advances in surgery, and increasingly, surgery is going to get better and better and better. And so the risk of sort of surgical complications is going to continue to fall. And we've seen that really successfully with the robots. I mean, when I was a junior doctor, if you had a radical prostatectomy, you stayed in hospital for 2 weeks and got 3 units of blood and all the rest of it. You go home on the same day or the morning after. So that regression will continue. So then what we've got to think about, well, what is our place in the world? Yeah, because the physiological impact of surgery is going to change very significantly. So what is our role going to be? And I think that I go back to things like the health inequalities again, because I think that more holistic care, the getting patients fitter for surgery preoperatively, all that sort of stuff, I think it's going to become more and more our work, because the job that we do in the operating theatre will start to become more straightforward for everything.
2 final questions from me. The first one, what's it like collecting an OBE?
So I went to Windsor Castle. It was coming out of COVID, so they restricted you to having one guest only. So I took my husband, which was actually quite nice. So we had to hand my children over to some relatives, and we got a morning on our own. And you turn up at Windsor Castle. The first thing that hits you is that everybody is so pleased to see you, because they know why you're there. And everyone from the footman at the gates, everyone is just massive smiles. Oh, congratulations, come this way, all of that. Get ushered through various rooms and into a final room where you're there with the other people that are going to be presented. And I think there was probably about 40 people that were getting some award or other.
Wow.
And you get a program which has your name on it, and that of all the people that are getting their awards. And so the only people that were there that I recognised their names were the Hendersons, who used to run the Nose to Tail restaurant in Smithfield. So they were there getting OBEs. So you then get taken through the process, and they give you instructions about where you're to stand, when you're supposed to walk up, where your partner's going to stand, or your person that you brought with you, and all the rest of it. And so they then call your name, and I had mine presented to me by, he was then Prince Charles, but now the King. And you walk up, says hello, and they've announced your name, and they announce why you get it. And he said, oh, so you're an anaesthetist. And he said, well, we always need those, don't we? And I was like, yes. He said, I bet you're just glad to have a day off. And I was like, actually, yeah, that really is spot on. And then they bring the medal to you, and you have a little chat. And then basically he shakes your hand, and that's the end of the conversation. Now, a bit like when you get, I don't know if you're like me, but when you stop and ask someone for directions, I stop listening after the first sort of 3 seconds. And I realised as he shook my hand that I'd done the same thing with the instructions from the chap that told us what you're supposed to do. So what I couldn't remember is how I was supposed to then exit. And so what I ended up doing was sort of backing away, bowing like a nodding dog. Therefore, we didn't get the video. So that was slightly embarrassing. But yeah, I mean, it was an amazing day. It was an amazing thing for me and my husband. What's funny is they don't even give you a tea. People think that you're going to get some sort of champagne reception afterwards, but it's very kind of like you go, you meet the royalty, then off you go again.
What an experience.
Yeah, it's cool. Very cool.
Yeah, fantastic. Brilliant.
Thank you.
What would you tell somebody else who they're looking at doing just a fraction of some of the things that you've done?
Well, my husband would hate me for saying this. Generally say yes. Because if you say no, it closes a door. And if you say yes, then you can always close the door later if you don't need to. And of course, I have closed the door on some things, but say yes if you can. And then the second thing is, do have balance. I still, I've had some illness myself recently, and I still am enthusiastic and optimistic about the work that I do. And it is probably because I try really hard not to work late into the night. And I try very hard, apart from when I can't avoid it, to keep my weekends for my family. And that's the privilege of being a consultant, of course. But yeah, have balance.
Brilliant. Fantastic advice to finish on. Thank you very much for joining us, Ramani, and thank you for sharing your peri-op profile.
Thank you, Andy.
Top Med Talk. Thanks for downloading Top Med Talk. Don't forget to subscribe, check us out on YouTube, and of course on social media. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and X. Also, it's important to remember that Top Med Talk is the broadcasting arm of EBPOM, Evidence Based Perioperative Medicine. We'd love you to find out more about that. And the way to do that is ebpom.org. Check out our website and find out about some of the incredible conferences we're going to be arranging across the year. ebpom.org.